Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, How Will Libraries Deliver a Sustainable Future?, which is sponsored by Elsevier. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar software. All of the attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. We're using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to ask questions of our presenters. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. So please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. Also note that there is closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please click the CC button on the bottom right corner of your screen. Also note that we have language interpretation for today's session. 4 languages are available: English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. To enable the language interpretation, select the interpretation globe icon at the bottom of your screen, then select the language of your choice, English, French, Portuguese, or Spanish, from the drop-down menu. Please note that our last presenter, Adriana, will be presenting in Portuguese, so if your primary language is English, you'll need to switch to the English interpretation to understand that portion. Along with this slide, I'll also be sending a PDF with instructions in the chat box. Last, please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version. And with that, we're ready to get started, so I'll pass things over to our moderator, Brito.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. It's a pleasure to be here at this ACRL Choice webinar, and we have as members of the panel Gwen Evans, who is Vice President for Global Library Relations at Elsevier. We have Gerald Beasley, who is the Carl A. Kroch University Librarian at the University of Cornell, and Adriana Ferrari, who is the Vice President for the Brazilian Federation of Librarians and Information Scientists. I am a Senior Vice President at Research Networks at Elsevier, and my previous experience was 40 years as a university professor in physics. I was the president at the University of Campinas in Brazil, and for 15 years, science director of the São Paulo Research Foundation. And the topic that we are going to be dealing with here today is how will libraries deliver a sustainable future? And if I can, here it is. I will start by presenting to you a ultra-fast introduction about the Sustainable Development Goals that were defined by the United Nations since 2015, as the whole discussion of the panel is going to be around those Sustainable Development Goals. So to start you in the subject, the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by the United Nations General Assembly back in September 2015 under the title of 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The Agenda for Sustainable Development covers a plan of action for people, planet, and prosperity. Very broad and very bold agenda, which looks at strengthening universal peace in larger freedom. And it deals with eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, including extreme poverty. It also deals with taking bold and transformative steps which are urgently needed to shift the world into a sustainable and resilient path. And the agenda is organized around 17 goals, which were called the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, that balance three dimensions of sustainable development: economic dimension, social dimension, environmental dimension. And the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are subdivided in 169 targets. They build on a previous effort by the United Nations, which was the Millennium Development Goals. And they seek to realize the human rights of all and to achieve gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. The SDGs can be simplified into 5 interlinked dimensions, which in the UN jargon they call the 5 Ps. First P is people. So it aims at ending poverty and hunger. Second P is planet, protect the planet from degradation. Third P, prosperity, ensure that all human beings can enjoy prosperous and fulfilling lives. The fourth P, peace, foster peaceful, just and inclusive societies. And the fifth P, partnership, mobilize the means required to implement the agenda through a revitalized global partnership for sustainable development. So this agenda is, as you can imagine, considering the boldness of the objectives and the boldness of the goals, is very, very complex and very, very difficult to achieve. Nevertheless, it is mobilizing organizations, universities, companies, governments across the globe. And just to give you a flavor for part of the challenges in what relates to libraries and what relates to research and academic activities, this is a figure that I built using data from SciVal, which is a tool that Elsevier offers for mapping research across the globe. And here I counted how many scientific publications were edited between 2016 and 2019, covering each one of the Sustainable Development Goals. So for the 16 development goals, we have strong ones like good health and well-being, which includes most of the health research in the world. So it's like 1,700,000 articles and publications and conference proceedings published in this 4-year period between 2016 2019, and the weakest one would be no poverty, 53,000 publications in the 4-year period. And of course, mapping this scientific production is relevant for universities, for research funders, for governments to define strategies, to plan for the future, and to find the ways in which they will be able to create the knowledge necessary to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. So that is my very quick introduction. And having said that, I'm gonna pass the floor to Gwen, who is going to talk to us about the power of using publications to advance the SDGs. Gwen, it's your turn now.
Thank you, Brito. I'm experiencing a little lag in the slides, but greetings everyone. Today I am going to speak about the data that can be used to analyze research output related to the SDGs. And I still do not have control of the slides, but we have mapped, as Brito mentioned, the 17 SDGs onto the global research enterprise as represented by the scholarly communication system. We look at research output, impact, funder data, patent data, topic or subject data, and collaboration network data. This analysis uses Scopus data analyzed in our SciVal Research Intelligence product and includes millions of documents and author profiles, billions of cited references, and thousands of global publishers over the period of 2016 to 2020. Research related to each SDG is thus easily identifiable. Focusing on the US, Canada, Latin America as a whole, Brazil, and Quebec, you can see that all regions publish heavily in SDG 3, good health and well-being, since this is where most medical research will fall. Focusing on the other SDGs, we can see that SDG 7, affordable and clean energy, also has quite a bit of output across all regions. Latin America is strong in research addressing zero hunger, quality education, and life on land. A bit of a surprise is the relatively lower research output around climate action, SDG 13, relative to other SDGs over this time frame, although that is accelerating. Excluding the US, we can see that besides SDG 7, affordable and clean energy, Canada and Brazil have relatively high output in SDG 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure, SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities, and SDG 13, climate action. Canada and Quebec have relatively high output in SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and Brazil and Latin America have high relative output in SDG 2, zero hunger. This chart shows Brazil's output share per SDG relative to the world's share represented by the horizontal black line at index number 1. Brazil produces a greater or equal share of its research output than the world in 11 SDGs, with the greatest difference in SDG 15, life on land. A mini case study is US-Brazil research collaborations on SDG 13, climate action. You'll see mention of the field-weighted citation impact, or FWCI. I won't go into depth, but what you need to know is that a FWCI greater than 1 means that research is more highly cited than expected in that discipline. The higher the number, the more impact. You can see that of all US research publications, 2% are a result of collaborations with Brazilian researchers. 17% of Brazilian research output around climate action is a result of collaborations with the US. The collaborative research has a quite high FWCI of 2.57, indicating that collaborative research is cited much more highly than the average expected citations for this SDG. The top key phrases for this collaborative research are not surprisingly dominated by the Amazon rainforest and its impact on climate change. Now let's move to SDG 5, gender equality. In Latin America, Brazil and Mexico top the charts for output related to research on gender equality, although research coming from Peru, Ecuador, and Uruguay have quite high field-weighted citation impacts, indicating they are highly cited compared to the norm. When Brazilian and Mexican researchers collaborate, you can see again that the field-weighted citation impact is greater for articles resulting from collaboration than either country's average FWCI in research focusing on this SDG. Top key phrases, they look like they're from SDG 3, but you can see that the field-weighted good health and well-being, but many of the articles containing content on gender equality or inequality are also about medicine or healthcare. Since 2015, Elsevier has produced a number of analytic research reports on gender designed to answer the call for a data-driven approach for addressing gender inequality issues and to understand the role gender plays within the global research enterprise, especially with regards to the research workforce. The following are just a few slides to illustrate what the global data show. The 2020 Gender Report looks at 15 countries over 2 time periods. Authors publishing during the period 1999 to 2003, that's the square at the bottom of the vertical line, and those publishing during the period 2014 to 2018, that's the circle at the top of the line. The horizontal black line in the middle denotes parity. That is, an equal number of women and men as authors. If a symbol is above the line in the green area, the ratio is more women. Below the line in the blue area is where the ratio is more men. What you can see is that the gender ratio is further from parity in the earlier period and closer to parity in the recent period, indicating that for all disciplines, there is a trend towards gender parity. For the discipline of environmental science, which is of course related to several SDGs, Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil all started with relatively more gender parity than the US or Canada, but it is Argentina and Portugal that have actually achieved more women than men publishing in this area. Here's a snapshot of Brazilian gender parity in research publication across all disciplines. In certain fields such as immunology, nursing, and pharmacology, it is women who dominate publication output, while mathematics and computer science are quite some way from gender parity and have not made much progress since 1999, as indicated by the very short line across the entire time span. These reports are freely available and contain much more detail on these topics than I can cover today. This power of data to advance the SDGs is a holistic look at the SDGs and their research ecosystem, focusing on the interconnection of the SDGs and the leadership needed to close the gap between scientific research, policy, and individual action. These reports focus on particular SDGs, affordable and clean energy, and 2 previous reports on gender equity in research. These reports and the data underlying them can be used by librarians, individual researchers, institutional leaders, funders, corporations, and policymakers to investigate the ways in which they can move both research and the action based on research forward. In some cases, the data is available to download. Thank you, and I'll put some more links in the chat and turn it over now to Gerald.
Thank you, Gwen, and thank you, Sabrina. Thank you, Brito, and greetings all. As Brito mentioned, my name is Gerald Weasley. I'm currently the Carl A. Kroc University Librarian at Cornell University here in Ithaca in New York State. And as you may be able to see on this slide, I'm also a volunteer fellow of something called the Sdg Publishers Compact, which was launched in October 2020 by the United Nations in collaboration with the International Publishers Association. And many academic publishers have already signed on to the compact. And as a librarian, I'm interested in harnessing what they're doing to advance the SDGs. And in this 10-minute presentation, I'll be suggesting some actions, concrete actions we might take in order to embed the SDGs in our everyday practice as academic librarians. Actually, the president of the Compact Fellows Group asked several of us to come up with our top 10 list of actions. And as you can see, we ended up with 13. So 13 is what we will have. And before I run through them briefly, I would like to say something about the land from which I'm delivering this presentation. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayakono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayakono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayakono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. And I also want to note that I worked with my Cornell colleague, Annalisa Raymer, to draft these recommendations that you are about to see. So here's the first 4. And by the way, please don't think you have to write them down or copy the links and so forth. My understanding is that they will be made available to everybody afterwards. And if you have any suggestions to add or improvements to offer, I know Annalisa and myself, we would be delighted. So please put them in the chat today, or suggest them in a Q&A, or send them in a follow-up email to me. We would be very grateful. So I'm going to go through all 13 actions very briefly. And firstly, I do think every academic library should refer to the SDGs in their strategic plans. In other words, achieving the SDGs should, I think, be a very visible part of every academic library's strategy. Action number 2 here is a reminder that a lot of work is already being done in library world, and that most of it is freely available if you have an internet connection. So there's no need to develop your own advocacy tools and things like that. Point number 3, support SDG research. It's kind of obvious, but I do think researchers engaged in SDG related work deserve our support, especially as they are often working across disciplines. So we don't want them to fall between the cracks, so to speak, of library services. And finally, on this screen, we're making the point that the SDGs are not only ambitious, but also super interrelated. No one institution will therefore be able to deliver on all 17, but sharing your institution's relevant strengths is going to help us achieve them together. Moving quickly on, actions 5 and 7 on your screen now are about making sure users actually connect with SDG related sources. And action 6 in the middle is another reminder that we will need the help of many communities to create and curate useful collections. This is definitely not a top-down process. Libraries will want to open themselves up to the expertise of the communities they serve, because sustainable development is in everybody's interest, and we really don't have time to waste on getting it wrong. And this slide suggests 3 actions that most libraries are already engaged in, but which I think would benefit from a clearer focus on their role in supporting the SDGs. So, for example, information literacy skills are desperately needed when there's so much misinformation and disinformation around about all the SDGs, perhaps climate change most noticeably at present. Helping people get to the right information is something librarians are really good at. And we don't want any barriers around that information when we get to it. So I do believe we should be, as it says here, opting for open whenever possible. Open access, open data, open source, etc. Now, these points on my last slide are very much about keeping ourselves on track via continual consultation with our stakeholders. I think assessment is especially important in this regard, because we really need to know that the SDG work we are doing is actually making a difference. And I do think that if the academic libraries can help the world achieve the SDGs and can be seen to do so, they're setting up what I call a virtuous circle for themselves. People are attracted to come into libraries, maybe even work in them, because they are such an important part of the solution. And this brings the passion and purpose that so many of us feel about sustainable development into the library. And we will need that passion and we will need that purpose to help us deliver our sustainable future. So thank you very much. And Adriana, over to you.
Obrigada. Vou aqui, tem.
Thank you very much.
Acho que minha fala
I
tá caindo o mundo aqui em São Paulo.
It's raining cats and dogs here in Sao Paulo, so I'm sorry you might hear some background noise. I'm going to be a little bit more practical than what we are doing. So I'd like to talk a little bit about where I'm talking to you from. I'm talking about the Federation, the Brazilian Federation opinion, which has over 62 years of presence and has been working with advocacy. We are talking about a country where we do not have a culture of public policies which are consistent regarding libraries. In other words, we have to advocate on its behalf.
De novo.
Oh, no, and I was able to change the slides. And for us to fulfill our mission, inspired as we are the Brazilian arm of IFLA, and for us to be able to develop our mission, we also work with many different groups and committees, and above all of our work has been aligned with the 2030 agenda. In other words, we have specific groups who are working on transversal aspects of the agenda. We started to do this idea and upholding the 2030 agenda in Brazil when we joined the project of the International Advocacy Program, where we reached the call of IFLA, and IFLA had prepared several materials showing how the libraries could be partners of a 2030 agenda. We in Brazil, as IFLA, have also built documents showing, because many times libraries already had activities in line with the agenda, but they didn't understand themselves as partners of the agenda. So as Professor Brito mentioned at the beginning, we have done a lot of work all over Brazil, which obviously has a continental size, talking about the agenda and allowing librarians to understand themselves as agents of change, agents who are actually a part of society. We are in the decade of action. The planet has no plan B, so the time is now. So we have a series of materials. Likewise, what do we understand? I'm sure that you look at the terrible news of what's happening in Brazil and the lack of government we have. So we in FEBAB understand that we not only have to be in the field of libraries, but also fighting with organized civil society for the 2030 agenda. The Bolsonaro administration is not committed to the 2030 agenda. In other words, we're part of a working group which is of the 2030 agenda, which monitors the 2030 agenda. So the libraries are showing the context of Brazil, the pandemic for us, which is a country which is in the most unequal region in the world, and Brazil, one of the most unequal countries. The pandemic has had very significant impacts, making Brazil go back to the map of hunger. This therefore makes a big difference when we're going to say that the libraries need to build a sustainable world when we have 27 million people in extreme poverty and we have 19 million people who are hungry. We are part of this working group, and we have also been working together with a CLAC showing the countries that access to information, as IFLA suggests, is something which is very important, are strategic inputs for the SDGs to be implemented. So we have conducted 2 activities championed by FEBAB, the Brazilian Federation, with activities in a CLAC, one in 2018, which led to the Santiago Declaration, where the countries recognize access to information, and another now in 2021, where we had an event, which obviously was conducted online, showing digital exclusion. In other words, those who are more vulnerable with a pandemic have become even more vulnerable, and where everyone closed in to be able to connect to the internet, which was the only window to the world, we showed therefore the digital exclusion, which obviously is a human right. Access to information today is a human right. And we in the Brazilian Federation continue to work with the libraries, and the libraries now during the pandemic have once again worked towards doing outreach activities for the population who is more vulnerable. So libraries started to also become centers for food donations, clothes donations, hygiene products, welcoming the more vulnerable population. Other libraries also taking books, some books with cultural equipment, as you very well know, were the first to be closed, and some people had nothing. So libraries continue to do work, taking, as you can see in the image, books and kits for people to not have no access to culture until some examples, as you can see here, libraries which were doing a delivery service, a take-home service of people who had no access to the internet, taking books on a door-to-door basis. As a federation, we also helped to develop a reading group on the SDGs, as we understand that we need to talk to the entire society on the 2030 agenda. As Professor Brito mentioned, the entire society must be involved, and libraries must be the spokespersons to say to society that they have right to dignified life, to human rights. So this is the answer we have to the 2030 agenda. Therefore, we realize that the libraries of all different types are moving forward, but we saw that there was still some resistance from the academic libraries to recognize themselves as strategic partners of the 2030 agenda. And we started to do some activities. This is a recent workshop which we had, even using an index, which Elsevier launched, showing ways for the libraries to go beyond offering content, which is what the libraries do on a daily basis, research, teaching, etc., but going a step ahead and looking also to the vulnerability of the academic communities. In other words, having a more encompassing approach. We in the Brazilian Federation, together with the support of Elsevier, sorry for the very strong rainfall noise behind me here. We've improved all the activities for people with disabilities who have had even more difficulty. Websites were not accessible, services were not accessible, and people were not able to communicate. Even in some of the health centers, we did some activities in this regard. And just to give you some examples of our university libraries, in the University of Philosophy, we created a podcast to show to society that many times society does not recognize certain areas as being crucial for one to reach the ODSs, for the SDGs in the area of humanity, in the case of a Brazilian government, which was always criticizing this. So we prepared a podcast to show to society in general what is it that the research which is within the walls of a university, how they reach people and how they change their lives. Likewise, we had activities with a lot of affection and welcoming. As the society has significant losses, this is something which we also saw took place in the university. students who live in student housing, with many cases of depression and suicide. So the library set up a reading group called Reading with Love, which is just to be a place to hear, to receive, and to welcome people through text, through literature, through books. And I'm speaking very, very quickly, but we also have said what the libraries, in fact, put forward. All the libraries make efforts to meet the population in a vulnerable situation, because we believe those are the people who, in fact, most need the library services. And I'm available to answer the questions. I think I met my time limit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adriana, and thank you especially for presenting under the big thunderstorm that we have been, we were able to listen during your talk. Hope it goes away quickly. Now we have time and opportunity for questions to our panelists. I think I will start with a question that I would want to present to the three of you, which is, could you briefly comment on how is the adherence or the interest of the academic research community to the SDGs or to the Sustainable Development Goals? Do professors know about the SDGs, care about, orient their research thinking about SDGs, or not, or more or less, or is it improving, or it is not improving? Why don't we start with, I'll go from my screen here, Gerald.
Thank you, Brito. In my experience, yes, there is actually a growing and significant awareness of the SDGs amongst the researchers that I meet and the research community in general. I do believe that this is reflective of a wider interest in the society, in fact. And I think that it's all to the good, and you can never have enough interest in the SDGs. So I look forward to it continuing to increase. What I'm hoping as well, mainly by talking about it actually, is that academic librarians see their place in that research community and actually see the role they can play in bringing the SDGs forward also. So I think actually we are fortunately surrounded by people who are actually very interested in bringing the SDGs forward. And I think what we most want to do is to link hands.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Gerald. Gwen, what's your take on this?
Well, since I am based in the US, I would say that if you say to the average researcher or institutional leader SDGs, they tend not to necessarily recognize that as a term. Although, as Gerald pointed out, they are very, very interested, especially librarians, in issues of social justice, of sustainability. So the recognition of SDGs is not strong in the US, but I think the interest is there. And the other thing about funding in the United States, especially for public universities, is that increasingly funders, and especially at the state level, they want to see the impact of the research that they're funding. And they want to see the societal impact, whether that's at a state level, a regional level, a community level, or a global level. So I would say that they are very interested in the goals of the SDGs, even though they may not be very familiar with the term SDGs.
Thank you very much, Gwen. Yeah, that goes with my experience too. The professors want their research to have an impact, to bring a benefit to society. They do not care too much if it's SDG number 2, 3, 4, or 5. But it's possible always to classify that benefit, right, under some of the SDGs. Let's go to Adriana, perhaps she could comment about how does this happen in Brazil? Are university professors and students connected to the idea of the SDGs?
Obrigada, Professor Brito. Ainda com
Thank you very much, Professor Brito. Was a full storm here around me. I'm going to try to speak louder so that you can hear me. I have an idea that we still have to do a lot for professors, for academia to engage with the 2030 agenda. In this journey I have done throughout Brazil, especially in the 2030 agenda group, we sometimes joke that we're having an aesthetic view of a 2030 agenda, more to qualify the SDGs and to truly engage in the advocacy of the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 agenda, because that's what matters. It's to see transformation, to see us committed to the agenda, to make it go forward, to move, to increase. Therefore, I think universities have a very important role. And I truly hope, and I think that sometimes things in universities, as you know very well, you have worked in universities. I think sometimes what happens from the outside in, I think sometimes universities start to show their rates and their metrics, etc., for the SDGs. This is something which is ongoing, and I hope it actually picks up very quickly, because we only have 8 years until 2030.
Thank you very much, Adriana. That's really encouraging. I have here a question from the audience, which is Bernie Folan asks the panelists to comment on the connection or lack of connection between funder priorities and programs to the SDGs. That's seems to me quite an interesting point, because many times research ends up being directed by funding opportunities. So perhaps let's go back to Gerald for this.
Well, thank you, Brito. In my view, it's rather in reference to what was said earlier, actually. I think there's a lot of good work being done that is not being associated with a particular SDG, or indeed with the SDGs in general. So funders, for example, will say, we wish to promote the infrastructure in research. Actually, it's essential to have good infrastructure for research in order to get an achievement around the SDGs. But where I think that the funders may not be making the link, we have to make the link. We have to say, actually, this fits with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Whether you have to feel affiliated to the United Nations view of the Sustainable Development, I personally think it is a very good way of approaching sustainable development, is to work through the SDGs. I would say that funders, they actually are supportive of the SDGs, even if they're not naming them.
Thank you. Gwen, do you want to comment on that, on funders and SDGs?
I think I've addressed it a little in the US context, but I want to reiterate what Gerald just said about that a lot of research is actually being done and actions are being taken based on that research. It's just not all, unless you can easily identify that research, it's it's not easy to map those out and say, yes, in fact, my institution is very strong in this. I think medical research, of course, maps very easily to SDG 3, good health and well-being, but some of the other SDGs, you have to do a process of refinement to say, yes, in fact, you have funded research that lines up with these SDGs. One of the other things that I would point out that is in that the SDG report is that articles that featured an academic corporate collaboration usually result in a quick translation of research finding into practical use. And the highest was for SDG clean energy. So again, it depends on how you interpret funding and R&D funding in terms of translating these SDGs into practical interventions.
Thank you very much, Gwen. Let me ask then a question to Adriana, which came from Tracy Bellinger. And the question, Adriana, is the following. We all talking about social justice, but there is an additional question here and point about the offering of educational opportunities, such as teaching how to use the internet or using digital media. How does that, is there a role for libraries in this field? You seem to have described some cases related to that.
If I can say, Brito, right away, yes, absolutely. I see libraries having a very strong role in that. So I would call that information literacy or media literacy or some ability to navigate. And sometimes that will be a role that is seen more by computer scientists and by librarians. But in any case, what we need to do is not just make material available, we also need to encourage people to have access to that material. And that means they have to both have the internet connection and they have to be able to discriminate between good information and not so good information.
Thank you very much, Gerald. Adriana, would you want to comment on this topic?
Yes, I believe that is a role of universities. We have, as we are Brazil, a country, as I mentioned, which is had such inequities, and libraries for many people are the only access these people have to the internet. One speaks a lot about everyone having a smartphone, but sometimes people don't have a data package. So libraries, especially during the pandemic, were extremely necessary. Where people came to them, for example, in Brazil, when there was a support for minimum income, government support for people who were in a situation of vulnerability, of extreme vulnerability, it was an app, right? People had to have a smartphone with an app to download that program and to be able to have access to the financial resources they had. So the libraries were what helped. Actually, voluntary librarians helping from their own smartphones, helping people, bridging giving sometimes small training sessions, not a structured training system because the libraries were closed. So yes, they do have that in their structure. So when we talk about the 2030 agenda, for example, job offers, preparing resumes, preparing people for an interview, training them in technologies for them to be able to improve their lives, obtain information. So this is something which is a very big novelty in libraries, and continuing education is also something which has been done by libraries. So I think we have to fight for libraries to be open, and that we are also fighting for this. I think this is something which is very interesting to mention. FABAB has been talking for us to have a bill in Brazil to be approved for people who already have access to minimum income programs may also have a data package free of charge. So we have also been fighting for this because this makes sense. One needs to have access to internet.
Now a question to Gwen. I'm directing it to Gwen, which is, how do you see open access publishing contributing or supporting the SDGs towards societal impact?
So I would say that open access is necessary, but it's such a, in a lot of ways, it's such a small first step. And I'm going to put my former hat on as the head of a state agency serving the library consortia of the Library Consortium of Ohio academic libraries. And there's information that can be freely available. And then there's the infrastructure or the funding that enables anyone to actually action that research in the world. So I think it's a first step, but it is not a sufficient step to actually make that societal impact. And I would just say, librarians like to think their job is the provision of information, but then there's what happens after you provide that information to move that action into the world. So it has a role, it is necessary, but it is not sufficient.
Thank you very much, Gwen. Now a question for Gerald, which is the following. Most of the time we tend to associate the SDGs directly with societal impact. And on the other hand, most universities in the world, and clearly in the US, have strong strategies to increase university-industry interactions and collaborations. And one of the interesting things that we found in our bibliometric analysis of the publications around the SDGs is that for SDG 7, which is the one on clean energy, and the other SDG on clean water, for example, and on health, there is a sizable amount of publications there, which include authors from universities and from industry, indicating that this collaboration is also a driver of attainment of the SDGs. Could you comment if you have noticed this kind of effect at the university?
So it's a great question again. We've had so many great questions this afternoon. I'm really thrilled, actually. On this one, I think there's two things that I would like to say. Academic libraries do need to make sure that their work is not exclusively academic in the sense of it doesn't apply to practice. So there should be, I believe, a lot of gathering in by academic libraries of research materials that can be applied directly. This is the decade of action, after all. And so we actually don't have a lot of time to make these connections. And the second thing I would say is I welcome the fact that there are many universities who will, in their own strategic plans, have societal impact inscribed as part of their reason for being. My own belief is that libraries, I'm a big fan of libraries, and I think we can be exceptionally good supporters of that. And we can also develop our own community engagement. There is nothing that says we have to work entirely through a university that has many different pressures on its time. So I would like to think that, yes, of course, we should be supportive of the institution. The institutions, I welcome the fact that they are moving towards, I would say, ever more towards societal impact, sustainable development. but that's not exclusive. That's not something that we have to do to the exclusion of other roles that we can play.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Gerald.
Thank you.
Now we have time for one last question, which was brought by Kimberly Evans, and I will direct that to Gwen. Gwen, you will have to remember your times at the University Library in Ohio. It is about how can libraries support staff, clerk, technicians, etc., be used to further the SDGs in academic libraries? How do you see the staff of the library contributing to the?
Well, as a former library staff person, I'm thrilled that this was asked. And to go back to Gerald's point, I think that there is a role that libraries are very familiar with community engagement. So as you know, as I was the head of the circulation desk when I was a library staff. So there is, that's a direct engagement with your patrons and helping to put on those events that may foreground the SDGs, or really in the daily activities that librarians or library support staff take on. I'm thinking of particularly things like making sure the building, the services, the content is as accessible as possible. That is promoting the SDGs in sort of a daily, quotidian, but that has impact on your user base and on individual people. The other thing are things like, how do you code? How do you catalog something? Is there a way that support staff can help foreground the materials they have on the SDGs? So I think that it is, there's the initiatives that a library may take as a whole, but there's also so many library support staff are engaged in day-to-day interactions in which they can make, they can embody in their interactions the SDGs.
Thank you very, very much, Gwen. Well, colleagues and friends, I think that we are up against the clock now. And I wanted to use this last 2 minutes to thank very specially our panelists, Gerald, Gwen, Adriana, and thank the wonderful audience that has been with us and that presented so many interesting questions in this extremely relevant discussion about libraries and their role towards assisting the completion of the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you all very much, and I hand back to Sabrina, our organizer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is Sabrina from Choice and ACRL. Thanks so much to our presenters for taking the time to present today, our interpreters for their great interpretations, and thanks to our attendees for your questions and comments. It was a really great and informative session. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and ACRL with a link to the recording. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. Your responses help improve our presentations. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something from the session, and we hope to see you again in the near future on another webinar.
Thank you, Sabrina.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Sabrina.
everyone.
And thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.